There are paintings that record history, and then there are paintings that try to overpower it. At first glance, Napoleon Crossing the Alps looks like a simple celebration of military courage. The image of a fearless leader forcing his way through a brutal mountain pass with the confidence of a man chosen by destiny itself. But the longer you look, the stranger it becomes. The horse rears up like a creature caught between panic and obedience. The sky seems to twist with the same energy as the cloak. The rocks feel less like part of the landscape and more like a stage built for revelation. And in the middle of all that movement, Napoleon appears impossibly calm, as if the storm around him exists only to prove that he cannot be shaken. That contrast is what makes this painting so powerful and so unsettling, because the deeper truth behind the image is that it was never meant to show events exactly as they happened. It was meant to show how power wants to be remembered. The painting, created by Jacques Louis David in the early 19th century, is one of the most famous portraits of political myth-making ever put on canvas. David was not just a gifted artist. He was one of the defining painters of his age, a master of dramatic composition and a central figure in the world of French neo. He understood that art could do far more than decorate walls or preserve likenesses. Art could shape memory. Art could direct emotion. Art could turn a man into a symbol. And by the time he painted Napoleon, Europe was entering a new era in which symbols mattered almost as much as armies. Napoleon Bonaparte had already become a figure of fascination across the continent. To some, he represented order after revolution. To others, ambition without limits. He was admired, feared, sent, and watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for men who seem larger than their own time. When he led French forces across the Great St. Bernard Pass in 1800 during the campaign against Austria, the event quickly offered something more than military value. It offered narrative value. It gave the new French leader a chance to be connected to the image of conquest, endurance, and command over nature itself. Yet the reality of the crossing was far less theatrical than the painting suggests. Napoleon likely crossed the mountains on a mule, dressed more practically, surrounded by the hardship and inconvenience that such a journey truly demanded. But that reality was not the one David chose to immortalize. He replaced the practical with the heroic, the difficult with the sublime, and the human with something close to legendary. That choice is not a flaw in the painting. It is the very heart of it. Napoleon Crossing the Alps is fascinating not because it hides its ambition, but because it transforms ambition into visual language so convincingly that generations of viewers have felt the force of its illusion. Everything in the image is designed to elevate Napoleon beyond ordinary leadership. He does not merely travel through the mountains. He seems to command them. Even the horse, powerful and unstable, becomes part of the message. Nature itself may be violent, but under the touch of this rider, it is brought into service. The painting tells us, without ever saying it directly, that true authority is not just military or political. It is almost spiritual. It carries the suggestion that some men do not simply move through history. They bend it around themselves. That is why the painting still matters. It is not just an artifact from the age of Napoleon. It is a lesson in how images create greatness. David understood that people do not remember power only through facts. They remember it through form, posture, color, gesture, atmosphere. A ruler who wishes to harden in memory must appear inevitable. He must seem born for command, and this painting performs that transformation with extraordinary precision. The angle of the body, the upward movement, the pointed hand, the sweeping fabric, the disciplined face. All of it works together to present Napoleon not as a man responding to circumstances, but as a force above them. That is where the mystery begins. The painting is not asking whether Napoleon was brave. It is asking something far more dangerous. What happens when a society begins to prefer the image of greatness to the texture of truth? What happens when the painted version of a leader becomes more real than the living one? The answer may be hidden in the painting itself. Because once you stop seeing this work as a historical scene and start seeing it as a carefully built machine of persuasion, every detail changes. The mountain becomes a monument. The wind becomes applause. The horse becomes drama. And Napoleon, seated at the center of the chaos, with his face untouched by fear, becomes exactly what this image wants him to become. Not just a commander crossing the Alps, but a man climbing into legend. The deeper you move into Napoleon Crossing the Alps, the clearer it becomes that this painting is not built like a memory. It is built like a performance. Every line, every fold of fabric, every movement of the horse, and every break in the mountain path seems arranged to guide the eye toward one conclusion. This man belongs above the world around him. Nothing in the image feels casual. Nothing feels accidental. The composition rises with such force that the entire scene appears to be climbing, not just across the surface of the canvas, but into the imagination of the viewer. That rising movement is one of the painting's greatest secrets. It does not simply show action. It creates momentum as a form of belief. The horse is the first sign of that strategy. At a glance, it looks like a symbol of danger, energy, and raw force. Its body twists, its front legs lift, its muscles tighten, its mane lashes through the air. It is a magnificent creature, but it is also unstable. It embodies nature in its most dramatic state, powerful yet unpredictable, and that matters, because the rider placed above it must then appear even greater. Napoleon does not mirror the horse's agitation. Oresis Italiano. His posture remains composed. His hand is steady. His expression is almost detached. The animal beneath him is seized by motion, but the man above it appears governed by purpose. This contrast is central to the entire image. David is telling us that real power is not loud. It does not thrash or panic. It governs. It remains calm, while everything else strains, bends, and trembles. In that sense, the horse is not simply a mount. It is a test. It is the visible measure of Napoleon's control. The same logic extends to the landscape. The Alps in this painting are not soft or welcoming. They are harsh, steep, and resistant. The rocks seem jagged enough to hurt the eye. The path is narrow, dangerous, and filled with struggle. Deep in the background, soldiers and artillery labor up the slope, their effort reduced to small but important traces of human burden. These figures matter because they remind us what a real mountain crossing would involve: cold, exhaustion, weight, confusion, and risk. Yet Napoleon is separated from that burden. He is placed in the foreground, elevated both physically and symbolically above the men who make the campaign possible. The army works. The leader means the men in the distance belong to reality. Napoleon belongs to vision. That distinction is one of the painting's most intelligent political movements. It transforms collective effort into individual myth. The campaign was carried by thousands, but the image condenses its meaning into one body, one gesture, one face. And that face is perhaps the most revealing part of all. There is no sign of fatigue there, no redness from wind, no fear of the cliff, no tightening of the mouth that would suggest effort. Instead, Napoleon's features are idealized into a state of perfect command. He looks less like a man in the middle of an impossible crossing, and more like a figure, already aware that history has chosen him. That is why his gaze feels so important. He does not stare at the ground, at the horse, or at the path ahead. He looks forward, beyond the immediate problem of the climb, almost as if his real destination is not Italy, but posterity. It is the gauze of someone painted for memory rather than observation. Then there is the hand. One arm holds the reins, but the other points upward, and that gesture does far more than direct movement. It gives the whole scene a sense of revelation. He is not merely going forward, he is leading upward. The gesture transforms travel into ascent, and ascend into destiny. It invites the viewer to read the mountain not just as geography, but as a moral and historical challenge that only a chosen leader can overcome. This is where the painting begins to feel almost religious in tone, even without using openly sacred symbols. David borrows the language of heroic elevation, of figures raised above ordinary men by clarity, will, and mission. Napoleon becomes less a commander than an appearance of order in a violent world. The cloak intensifies. That effect, it does not simply hang from his shoulders. It erupts behind him, catching the wind with such energy that it nearly becomes part of the sky. Fabric, in great paintings, often tells us something emotional that the face refuses to say. And here, it announces force, grandeur, and theatrical presence. It enlarges him. It surrounds him with movement. It turns his silhouette into something unforgettable. Even color plays a role in this act of transformation. The richer tones around Napoleon separate him from the colder and rougher terrain, making him seem less like someone trapped by the landscape, and more like someone imposing his own presence on it. One of the most intriguing details lies in the rocks themselves, where names are carved to connect Napoleon with the memory of earlier conquerors. This is no minor decoration tie-on. It is a quiet act of canonization. The message is simple and bold. Napoleon does not stand alone in this mountain pass. He arrives accompanied by history. He is placed in the same lineage as figures whose names evoke conquest, endurance, and empire. In one gesture, David makes the painting look backward and forward at the same time. It honors the past while claiming that a new giant has joined its ranks. That is why the painting can be read on multiple levels. It is a portrait, a political statement, a historical fiction, and a psychological instrument all at once. It shows us what power looks like when it wants to appear natural, graceful, and unquestionable. It shows us how visual beauty can smooth over physical difficulty and turn ambition into inevitability. Most of all, it reveals how carefully greatness can be staged. Because the more closely you examine this image, the more you realize that every symbol is doing two jobs at once. It dazzles the eye, and it instructs the mind. It says, admire this man, but it also says, believe in him. And once a painting begins asking for belief, it is no longer just showing the world, it is trying to shape it. And this is where the painting reveals its most unsettling truth. Napoleon Crossing the Alps is not just a portrait of a leader. It is a blueprint for how power wants to be seen. Once you understand that, the image changes completely. The horse is no longer only a horse. The mountain is no longer just a mountain. The wind is no longer weather. Everything becomes part of a larger system designed to lift a man beyond the limits of ordinary experience and place him somewhere closer to myth. That is why the gap between reality and representation matters so much. The real crossing was difficult, practical, cold, and deeply human. The painted crossing is elevated, controlled, and almost supernatural in tone. But David was not making a mistake by changing the truth. He was creating a more useful version of it. He understood that history is often remembered not through exact details, but through images strong enough to replace them. And in that sense, this painting does not merely depict Napoleon. It manufactures Napoleon for the future. That is why it still feels modern. Even now, long after the empire has fallen and the battles have become textbook material, the painting speaks to something very familiar. We still live in a world shaped by carefully designed images of leadership. We still see public figures presented through posture, symbolism, lighting, costume, controlled emotion, and visual narrative. We still respond to the illusion of calm authority in the middle of chaos. David's canvas may belong to the early 19th century, but its logic is timeless. It teaches us that greatness is often not just achieved. It is staged, framed, and repeated until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. That realization has led to very different interpretations of the painting over time. Some viewers see it as one of the highest achievements of political art, a masterpiece of composition and symbolic force that captures the energy of an era when individual ambition seemed capable of reshaping Europe itself. Others see it more critically as a brilliant act of visual manipulation, proof that even the most refined art can become an instrument of power. Both readings are valid, and that is part of what keeps the painting alive. It refuses to be exhausted by a single meaning. On one level, it is undeniably beautiful. The energy of the forms, the command of movement, the balance between chaos and control, all of it reveals a painter working at an extraordinary level. But on another level, the painting invites suspicion. Why must Napoleon appear so untouched by effort? Why must the landscape submit so perfectly to its symbolic rise? Why must the labor of the many fade behind the image of the one? These questions do not weaken the work, they deepen Italiano. They turn admiration into inquiry. And that may be the most lasting power of the painting. It allows itself to be loved as an image, while also exposing the mechanisms by which images demand loyalty. The names carved in the rock become especially important here. They are easy to miss at first, but once noticed, they change the entire scene. They connect Napoleon to Hannibal and Charlemagne, placing him within a grand historical lineage that stretches far beyond the immediate event. This is not simply a military commander crossing a dangerous pass. This is a man being inserted into the architecture of legend. The mountain becomes a gate between the present and immortality. And David acts almost like a priest of memory, performing the ritual that admits Napoleon into the company of history's giants. That is a staggering act of visual confidence. It tells the viewer that the man before them is not merely important. He is inevitable. He belongs among the figures who define centuries. But that confidence also reveals the central tension of the work. Greatness in this painting does not emerge naturally. It is assembled. It depends on selection, exaggeration, omission, and style. The suffering of the crossing is reduced. The roughness of the leader is erased. The practical details of the event are transformed into emblems. In other words, the painting does not discover myth, it builds it. And once you see that, the image becomes even more powerful, not less. Because now, it is not only a portrait of Napoleon, it is a portrait of the human desire to believe in figures who appear larger than life. It shows us how easily we are drawn to images that promise certainty, control, and destiny. It reveals how art can make authority feel beautiful, even noble, before we have fully asked what that authority might cost. That is why Napoleon Crossing the Alps continues to fascinate viewers who know perfectly well that it is not literally true. Its power was never based on factual accuracy. Its power comes from the emotional truth it creates. The feeling that history has condensed itself into a single, unforgettable body on a rearing horse, pointing upward through wind and stone as if the future itself were waiting to obey. And perhaps that is the final question the painting leaves behind. When we stand before images like this, are we witnessing greatness, or are we witnessing the moment greatness is invented? Because maybe the true subject of this painting was never Napoleon alone. Maybe it was the creation of belief itself, the instant when art stops recording power and begins teaching the world how to bow before it.